So anyway, as he said, Tom Nickel, Nickel Beer Company, O'Brien's, pub at Lake Cuyamaca. Also going to get a plug-in for the International Beer Competition, which will be happening in October. Just to start, I've been brewing wet hop beers probably since my days at OG's in about 1997. Back then it was stuffed pizza. There were no local hops at the time, but there were growers that would send them down and overnight them. Since then, you know, a lot of local hops did pop up. COVID, unfortunately, killed a lot of the local hop industry here. I don't know if any of you ever made it by Star B Ranch in Santa Isabel and Ramona area. So yeah, they had at one point got up to 4 acres of hops. And we bought a lot of their hops. And so when I started brewing wet hop beers at Nickel Beer Company in 2014, we were doing all local hops, which worked great right up until COVID. And then there was basically nothing to be had. And so now we get a lot of our hops from Oregon, but there's still growers in Washington that send them down. I do have to issue an apology to everybody who was at the brew day that we had a couple weeks ago. We had a glycol issue. I don't currently have a functioning glycol machine at the brewery. So we can imagine that's a bit of a problem. It is being very temperamental, so I wasn't able to cool and transfer and carbonate the beer that we brewed that day, but I have 2 other beers that we'll be tasting, and I have notes on those down in the bottom. So one is with Chico grown hops, and one is with Oregon grown hops. And we still do the beer that we brewed was still San Diego hops. And unfortunately, we were just discussing with Kurt a second ago, the local hop harvest was very much hampered by the lack of spring. The hops that we get are from a grower in the San Diego Country Estates area. So it's kind of very northeast Ramona, about 2,500 feet. And we basically went from winter to spring, or winter to summer. And although that was great for the apples, which just like a lot of frost, it was very bad for the hops, who actually like an actual growing season to grow up. So even though he's now in his 4th year, his harvest was 1/3 what it was last year because of the lack of spring. So we're only going to be doing 2 hops or 2 beers with his hops this year. So this year, I think we're going to end up at about 7 wet hop beers total. So usually in the past I've brewed somewhere between 7 and 10, and a lot of that is dependent on my ability to get locally sourced wet hops, which usually harvest earlier than all of the hops up in Oregon or Washington. Typically, in a normal year, our hops down here would start harvesting anywhere from the last week of July to about the middle of August. This year they didn't start harvesting until about the 3rd week of August down here. So the local hop harvest and the Oregon hop harvest really kind of crossed over. And so I'm used to kind of being able to brew San Diego wet hops for a few weeks and then all my Oregons for a few weeks. And we even do one with Idaho 7 hops, which I love because they harvest the last week of September, which is great. So it helps me kind of space everything out without having to brew 8 beers in 2 weeks. So wanted to kick off, and anytime we're ready, Lauren, we can go ahead and pour that first beer. Just talk about difference of wet hops, fresh hops, and dried hops. So wet hops, the major difference is the water weight. They're about 90% of their full water weight. Hops are picked, kilned, usually 140, 180 degrees, dried, and then kept at sub-zero temperatures. It amazed me the first time I ever went to Yakima. I did not know. How many people knew that hops just spontaneously combust? Okay, a few people. So Liz definitely did. So blew my mind. And if you talk to people in the hop industry in Yakima, there's actually stories about great fires where they lost double-digit percentages of entire harvests. So what happens is the hops are still evaporating the water weight even at like 32, 34 degrees. So they have these massive rooms, twice as tall as this, hops everywhere in bales when they're still in their whole cone form with thermometers everywhere. And there's just guys whose only job for the 2 to 3 weeks that the hops are in there is to go around and check every thermometer for hot spots. And the hops, because of all the evaporative heat causation, will actually just spontaneously combust and catch fire. And apparently it's a very common occurrence. That blew my mind. I had no idea. But so thankfully, it doesn't happen to us. You need a lot of hops. and you need to pack them together very tightly. So these are obviously in huge bales. If you have a nice loose bag of hops, you do not need to worry about spontaneous combustion. So the water weight is the big difference, and that's one of the major things that will impact how much you use within the brewing process. The other term you'll often hear is fresh hops. And so there's a lot of beers, Sierra Nevada Celebration, probably the most famous one that carries the term fresh hop on its label. And so what that is that is a beer that is brewed with dried hops, but right at the beginning of the harvest season when they are first processed. So in sort of technical terms, a fresh hop beer uses dried hops, but just like I said, as soon as they could be processed. So a few breweries now you'll see kind of are using like that term around Southern Hemisphere hops. So you'll see some fresh hop beers in the spring relating to the usually April timeframe of the harvest of the hops down in Australia and New Zealand. And then, the fresh hop beers, usually October, November is about the earliest you could possibly get those out, because the vast majority of those hops that are harvested each year are held for pelletization, which then doesn't usually start happening until November, December, once the fear of them spontaneously combusting is passed. So a couple different terms you'll see thrown around. And like I said, then dried hops are what we all know and love. And, fresh hop beers are also often whole cone beers. And so one of the other big stumbling blocks for a lot of professional brewers, especially on wet hop beers, is most breweries are not set up to do whole cone brewing. Sierra Nevada is literally the only brewery I know of that is exclusively whole cone brewing. And thank you very much. Most breweries don't use a lot of them. I contract them because I use my mash tun as a giant hop back, which I'll go through tonight because that's exactly how I brew my wet hop beers. But if you don't contract whole cone hops, most hop distributors don't have them available for spot sale. So they've got to be pre-contracted. So like I said, the vast majority of breweries are simply not using them. Most IPAs are now dry hopped in the fermenter, recirculated. You've got all kinds of, cryo, hop powders, hop oils. And so, everything that's kind of happened with what you'd consider modern hop science in the last 20 years is how do we use a more distilled, purified, extracted form of the hop without all the vegetal material. And like I said, then you've got Sierra Nevada, everybody's favorite stick in the mud. Like, no, we're still using the whole hop just as it is. So, and that's really kind of a lot of what you'll see with wet hops. So I'm going to divert here for a second and tell you about the beer. Cheers, by the way. Sorry, that was rude. I should have done that first. So this is Overnight to Julian. There's a guy down here whose family owns a farm up in Chico, and they grow Cascade and Chinook hops. And this is kind of a unique beer for us because in addition to using Cascade and Chinook wet hops, it also uses Cascade and Chinook steam distilled wet hop oil in the cold side as a dry hop, and a very small amount. It's I'm going to guess about 100 milliliters in 7 barrels. So I emulsify it in alcohol and then add that in cold side, and it definitely, you can't even get your nose near this stuff. And, it comes in like the old White Labs little yeast vials, and opening it up even like 4 or 5 feet away. Just, don't want to get my nose too close to that because it will burn. But it's something else we use in this. So the name originated because at the time I first brewed this was the first wet hop brew we'd made at Nickel with beer with hops not from San Diego. So it was a nod to the fact that the hops were overnighted. So now, like I said, we do a couple Oregon beers, so this is maybe a little bit less unique within that process. And then I put down here a base for the recipe. So once we get kind of through a little bit more, anybody who has recipe questions, formulation questions, all of that, we can go through that. But if anybody had any specific questions just on this beer, I'd be happy to address them right now. No? It tastes okay? Okay. So, I try to keep the bitterness, it's an IPA, but I try to keep the bitterness somewhat mild so that it's firm enough that it lets you know it's an IPA, but not so overwhelming that it takes away from the more subtle notes that you're going to get from the wet hops. So I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit just in the terms of second section there, what to brew with wet hops or what to know about brewing with wet hops, and talk about some of the flavors. So the number one thing I get when talking to other brewers, and they say, "Oh yeah, and I love brewing wet hop beers," and they're like, "I don't like that grassy flavor," and that is definitely something that can be present, but something that doesn't have to be present. And I think that's very hop specific. In some cases, how well the hops are grown, how long you're using them, what kind of shape they're in when they're harvested, what kind of shape the alpha acids and the oils are in. So I don't think that that's an inherent flavor to wet hop beers. I think you can get that in a lot of beers, especially things that have a lot of vegetal material in them. So I think that could happen with a lot of whole cone beers, period. And I think that the flavors of that grassiness is something that it's not something to be afraid of. It's going to be a flavor that may or may not happen. This beer, I definitely think, has a little bit of that grassiness, but not necessarily in a bad way. Yeah. No problem. No dumb questions, just dumb answers.
So this is 100% wet hop beer.
Well, 100% wet hop on the flavor side. So I do use some pellets for bittering. And in this case, this was, actually, I take it back. This was Chinook whole cone hop for bittering in the mash.
So that would have been fresh hop cones.
Well, whole cones, but not fresh. So dried whole cone Chinook.
Leaf
hops, yes. Leaf hops in the mash.
It's so complex. I apologize. But so would you ever do 100% wet hop, or is that just the stupidest thing to do? Because we absolutely so many have, hops.
And it's I've got an example here on this bitter that we did that was 100% wet hops with no kettle hops as kind of a scientific experiment. I will say bittering with wet hops to me is a waste because of the amount of them that you need to use, and save them for the end. So I do one of two things. One, I bitter with something clean, or I bitter with something that's a hop in the beer I'm brewing. So in this case, it was Chinook and Cascade. Cascade, bitterness. But the Chinook that I had and the flower hops, I think, were 12.5. So I used those. And then for the Centennial beer that we'll taste in maybe 10 or 15 minutes, that was all Centennial pellets in the bitterness. So I, trying to keep at least the same vein going.
And the reason I ask is because, you go out there and you can try a lot of different wet hop beers when it's the season, but you don't know how much wet hops were there, right? And that's why I asked somebody that does this constantly, because I feel, is it a waste? But when I made this one time, this what I call the lobster beer, because it had all wet hops, it's more hops than you could fit in the damn kettle and very high amount of loss. The tea-like properties that came out of that beer were insane.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic, but it's not really it's something you would do for your friends that you wouldn't do to sell. Yeah. And do you find that the tea-like, where do you get the right amount of tea-like properties that you never get out of pellets? How do you figure that out? At what time to add these?
Well, so we'll go over amounts that I use in a minute. But the big thing, like I said, is using the wet hops to me as late in the process as possible. And the other thing that I'm a huge proponent of, you make an IPA. What's the most natural thing in the world? You dry hop it. So I'm a huge proponent of using wet hops in the dry hop edition. And I would say there's some breweries, that make a wet hop beer. They're still using dried hops in the kettle, late in the boil, or as part of the dry hop. And I'm not against that at all. They make great beers, and it's a way to bring, some of those great tea-like flavors that you're talking about into, the hop flavors that everybody kind of knows and recognizes and sort of expects out of IPAs. One of the things my favorite thing about having a brewery an hour away from everything is that, I'm not dependent upon brewing anything. I brew what I want. Thankfully, people like the beer that I brew. They come there, and I'm not canning, I'm not selling, I'm not distributing, so I'm not worried about, trying to convince a greater marketplace about drinking what I have. I make small batches, brew the beer I want, and thankfully I love wet hops, and there's enough people that like them that I can get away with it. If nobody bought them, I wouldn't make 10 of them. That's for damn sure. At some point, I have to be a bit of a businessman. But, if I were a production brewery, canning, and a wet hop was a singular release and I could make one of them, that would be all I could do. I mean, I alter my entire brewing schedule to fit this many beers in. So, for me, it's definitely a passion project. And those tea-like flavors that you're talking about, some of those more subtle things, like this beer, to me, there's two very different components to it. And the Cascade is that kind of subtle, juicy fruit kind of gum flavor, that it has some stone fruit in it, and maybe a little bit of berry notes. And then the Chinook, which there we go. California grown Chinook, to me, throws a lot of green peppercorn and kind of spice. It doesn't have that kind of classic piney, resiny flavor that you see up in the Northwest. And so I think that the uniqueness of hops grown in different areas is also one of the joys of doing this. And, being able to grow hops in your backyard with a friend around San Diego, getting fresh hops, through a brewery or homebrew store or homebrew distributor. It's going to be different every time. It's an agricultural product, and to me, it's the time that beer most feels like an agricultural product because it's the time you're least in control of it. So,
Yeah, how do you store the wet hops? From your end of boil all the way to your dry hopping.
Vacuum sealing.
Vacuum sealed.
Vacuum seal hops, and I just keep them in the fridge. And back when Eric March was in charge of Star B, he was San Diego's biggest hop grower and trying to start a San Diego Hop Growing Association. And he had 4 acres of hops and probably, I'm going to guess, at the peak, probably almost 24 different varieties. And so he and I would just nerd out a lot and did try different things with hops. And so we would vacuum seal them and freeze them. We would vacuum seal them, refrigerate them. We would vacuum seal them and wait to brew for 4 weeks. So, there were a lot of different things that we tried over the course of time. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I'm sorry. I've been lagging on the slides there, but we'll walk through that in just a second. But so vacuum sealing to me has been a great way to do it. And what I do is, especially like sometimes when the hops come in from Oregon, everything's coming in warm. They've been on a UPS truck for a day. So we'll take all the hops that we need for the brew day, and then I'll usually section off maybe a little less, about 3/4 of a pound per barrel. So not a ton, but enough to have a flavor impact. And then set that aside, chill it down, so that I vacuum seal them already cold.
Tom,
So
that's you vacuum sealing.
oh, that's literally me vacuum sealing. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, you can see my Food Saver vacuum sealer. And so I just put it in big bags and it just compact the hell out of them. And it sounds kind of sacrilegious because they have these beautiful whole cone hops. In this case, this is the Chinook hops that we had, which are nice, big, kind of real pointy cones. And I just smash them in the bag as hard as I can. So trying to eliminate all airspace. And, it's one of those things that first time, I show another brewer how to do it. They're kind of like, "Ooh, just tamp it down." Like, no. You got to put your, it's like stepping on them, because you want to compact them as much as possible, get out the airspace. And every now and again, a bag goes bad because I didn't seal it properly. But I've never had a bag that was well sealed spoil, and I've never had them sit around for more than about 7 weeks. So I can't speak to like how long do they last? Do they last better in a freezer than a fridge? I don't know. But vacuum sealing and freezing them, we didn't notice any difference between them being vacuum sealed and frozen and vacuum sealed and refrigerated after about 2 or 3 weeks for dry hopping in terms of flavors or any differences like that. And now a bunch of the hop growers are selling fresh frozen wet hops. So they'll take a certain, I'm assuming they're flash freezing them, but then you can buy, like wet mosaic hops in February. And they just show up literally as a frozen block of hops. So I've only brewed with those once up at Viewpoint Brewing, but beer tasted great. The large, solid block of ice definitely took some of the romance out of it. I'll say that. But the beer tasted great. So I'm all for things that allow people to use ingredients maybe they can't use in the fall or the summer when they're coming off a busy brewing season. So I'm not gonna say anything negative about the fresh frozen hops. But yeah, so the vacuum sealing was something we started long ago, probably back in 2015, and I was spoiled because, of course, Star B was right down the road from me. So if I needed hops on a Tuesday for dry hopping, I'd call up Eric and I'm like, yeah, can I get 8 pounds of Chinook today for a transfer? And so very spoiled, and then had to work ways around it. So that's when the vacuum sealing became a primary for me. And before, it was just something Eric and I did for fun because, like I said, I could usually pick the hops right up until the last harvest of his that I needed right away. So just curious, what are some other flavors you guys get out of this beer? Because I'm always fascinated by what people pick out of beer. And I love the feedback section of the club as I walked in. So.
There's a microphone.
Yeah.
Hey, I almost thought it was more of a texture thing, that maybe a little silkiness or resinous on the tongue. Love the flavors, and I was just like, what's different about this?
Yeah, it's definitely like a suppleness to it, I would feel, to wet hop beers. And again, I purposely, like I said, sort of back off the bitterness a little bit. But I mean, it's, and I never think that beers travel as well carbonation-wise in a growler as they do on tap. But, it's definitely got a little bit softer feel in general. I would say all of my wet hop beers do. And I think that's very true because there's definitely an edge that I think the dried hops have in terms of, giving a little bit more in terms of the oils versus the water weight. And, especially with pelletized hops, I mean, everything's so much more extractable. Yeah, so that's what I say. Some of that stone fruit from the Cascade for sure.
So when you get fresh hops in, how do you evaluate them? Do you make a tea or just smell them or wave your
No,
hand
so
over 'em?
the whole hops when they come in, and fortunately getting a shipment tomorrow, so I didn't have any to bring here. They come in and you can break the cone in half and see all the little yellow lupulin glands in there. Note to self, that'd be a great thing to take a picture of next time. But so you can just smell them right away. And I mean, they're coming in these big, well, you saw the big 20-pound box that I was packaging out of. And so both our local grower and the shipping, they both use basically the same boxes. But so it's just very, primary senses in terms of seeing and smelling. And, the funny thing is that the hops from San Diego, they look great. The guy's picking them by hand. I mean, it's very labor of love. And anybody who's thinking about growing hops, it's really not an easy thing to do. So I admire people who do it. But the Oregon ones often come in a little brown, and because they have to pick 60 acres of something, in a week, and if it's perfect, or maybe 10 hours pre-ripe when they start picking, 3 or 4 days later when they're done with that field, the last ones are going to be a little sunburned, and there's just no way around that. But it's, to me, never impacted the flavor or anything in the brewing process whatsoever. It's just very cosmetic. So that's Zip, the brewery dog, our Aussie Shepherd. He's extremely friendly. But so it's just you look at them, you smell them, you touch them, but and I've gotten to know, like I said, a little bit in terms of what I expect from, I don't normally associate stone fruit with Cascade, but wet Cascade, I absolutely do. I always think of Chinook as being piney and resiny, but the wet Cascade or wet Chinook that I get from California isn't that way. Last couple of years, like I said, because of the lack of local wet hops, we've expanded to using Centennial, Strata, Amarillo, and then the Idaho 7, which again, versus those hops normally definitely give off a little different flavor. So we can probably pour the Centennial beer anytime then, and we can chat about that in just a second. So flavors are definitely different. Impact is definitely different. Overall impression is definitely different. And then aromas are definitely different. So there's a lot that, is different about wet hop beers. There's a lot that's the same. The big question is, how do you use whole cone hops and in what amount? So as far as amounts, because they're 90% water, it kind of depends on what style you're going for. I think of everything in terms of barrels, so I tried to break a few of these things down in terms of, like a 5-gallon batch. So for the IPAs, between the bittering hops that I don't count in this total, that's separate. So just the finish hops and whatever I'm counting for dry hops, I'm at about 10 pounds per barrel for an IPA. And so that's a little over 1.5 pounds for a 5-gallon batch. And so it's a not insignificant amount of hops, and that's why I said growing them is definitely a labor of love. Doing something like a pale ale or a lager, obviously way less than that. So I would say a pale ale, I'm typically in about the 4 or 5 pound per barrel range. And then we've done this beer, the example here beer was 34 pounds and seven barrels. So it was five pounds per barrel, which would be, like I said, about 3/4 of a pound per a 5-gallon batch. What was the question right in front? Oh, sorry. Well, like I said, they're about 90% water weight. So, extrapolate that out. I mean, most IPAs are about 2 pounds per barrel to 4 pounds per barrel. So it's probably somewhere about in that range. If you eliminated, 90% of the water weight, I'd be at about 1 pound per barrel, maybe a little over on the finishing side. And then I'd have a couple pounds usually one way or another in the bittering side. So I probably, if you pound for pound dry hops to wet hops, eliminated all the water, it's probably a little bit less overall if you dried them out. But again, 10 pounds per barrel, it's a ton of hops. Pound and a half of fresh hops, and again, that's just finishing, so that doesn't count bittering or any other additions. That's just on the finishing side. So I want to get to this example with the bitter in a second, because it'll, I think, answer some of the questions about like what's the impact, how do you use them, and whatnot. But as far as the how-to, so I just want to skip ahead. So that's our mash tun right there. That's our brewer Ray. I'm just going to skip ahead a bunch of hops, but a bunch of slides here. Everybody's seeing mashing in. There we go. So the hops coming in. Rude, Vorloff, Sparge. Okay. Some guy packing hops. Yep. Okay. So there's our nice clean mash tun after mash. And this is always Ray's favorite part. We fill it back up and make a mess of it again with the wet hops. So when I'm brewing with the beers, this is how I use them. Basically taking my mash tun, and I call it a hop back, but it's kind of a misnomer. So in most cases, if a brewery has a hop back, it's something that they're packing with hops and then running the beer through. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm literally transferring the entire batch into the mash tun post-boil, and then letting the hops soak there during my entire runoff. So rather than using that as just a pass-through while it goes to the fermenter to cool down, I'm literally soaking the hops in there for the whole time. So that's how I use them in the brewing process. A lot of different ways you could use them in terms of, steeping bags and actual hop back, dry hopping, cold side. But so if, now I'll do it. Cheers. Thank you for having me, guys. Appreciate it. Yeah. That's a hop spa, exactly. And I'm just going to kind of run through this. So again, back in the days when there were multiple hop farms in San Diego and we get away with doing silly things, Scott Blair, South Park Brewing, Hamilton's fame, now owns a bar in somewhere west of Asheville, North Carolina. So tiny little town, opened a Scottish themed bar to go with his Scottish heritage. And anybody who'd met him, you'll appreciate the beer name, Blair's Not Bitter, because he was often one of the most feisty people in the beer business. But so we wanted to do something, and I think this touches on an earlier question, that was 100% wet hopped. And we didn't want to do anything too crazy because we knew we weren't going to derive a lot of bitterness. And so we used this method of soaking the hops in the mash tun, made ourselves English style bitter. You can see kind of, I just glossed over the recipe here. It was a Maris Otter and Pale Ale base with just a dash of crystal malt, a little bit of wheat, and a dash of chocolate malt. Both of those for color, without giving too much body. And then we used the Lacruda yeast strain that Tommy Arthur used at Port Brewing in Lost Abbey. Mashed at 152, got down to a 1010, so a nice 4.1, very traditional bitter. The hops, we did 100% post-boil in the mash tun Glacier, which sadly we can't get anymore. But we had it analyzed at 2.7% alpha acid, so super low. And it is one thing I will say about hops grown pretty much anywhere south of Oregon is not only will you see a flavor difference, but expect all of your alpha acids and oils to be a little bit lower than anything you'd see in the Northwest. And that's not because we have worse soil. It's not because Californians are bad people. It's just that we don't have the length of day. It doesn't matter how much you water them. You just can't make the sun shine for 2 or 3 extra hours a day. And so you look at a place like Yakima that gets almost 18 hours of sunshine in the peak of summer, along with abundant snow water runoff, and the hops have exactly what they want. Well drained, well watered soil that sits in the sun for almost the entire day. And so we just can't compete with that. So definitely you see lower alpha and beta acids down here. So we use 26 pounds in the mash tun in this particular beer. And then we dry hopped with an additional 8 pounds, 5 pounds of the Glacier, and then 3 pounds of Nugget that we got from the Star Bee Farm. We tested it 9 days after it was set on the dry hops, and we got 19 IBUs out of it. And that was without adding a single hop in the mash or the kettle. Everything was derived from this 195 to 205 degree soak of the hops post-boil. So we all know you get hop pickup, hop bursting, late additions. It definitely counts for your IBUs, both in how hot the beer still is, and isomerization happening down to at least 190 degrees, and the fact that you're often using a lot of hops at the end. And so in this case, 26 pounds is a ton. Our utilization was terrible, and the alpha acids were low, but we still managed to get 19 IBUs out of it. So I put all the other specs on the beer there. So one of the reasons I don't use a ton of bitterness up front is I know that we are getting perceived bitterness from the hops just using them in the mash tun. And while I'm got these going, let's see if in order here. So here we are. You can actually see the beer running off, this kind of like yellow reflectiveness you see throughout that. That's not the green, that's the beer coming up underneath the hops. So we just run it in underneath very gently. The beer is hot. And then what he's doing right there is kind of literally tapping down the hops. They want to float just a little bit. They still have water weight. So, but once they get fully saturated with the hot beer, they tend to stay down pretty well. And there we are, nearly full. And you can definitely see kind of how spiky some of those Chinook cones are. And then, there we go, an actual video of the tapping down of the hops. Not me, because I don't wear a wristwatch, so I can't give. Yeah, so you can see too how full the mash tun is. We've got a full 7 barrels of beer in there. So it's not at the very top, but it's certainly very close. And that's just the hydrometer there. So let's see, we'll go skip back past the video. There we go. Keep some hops in there. So again, this is, like I said, how I use them in terms of, like I said, a hop spa, I think, is a much better term than a hop back. But this allows me to kind of get everything that I want out of the wet hops. And in 1 hour of the hot, they look like used turnips. So all the color, all the beauty, everything is gone. They definitely get much paler. And thankfully, a lot of farmers pick them up for nitrogen compost. But it's kind of funny that, here people spend the entire year growing them. I throw them into hot wort, and 1 hour later, they're literally garbage. So this beer, oh, good. Yeah, so in total, it's about an 18 to 20 minute transfer time to get it full. And then depending on, where our glycol's at, working. We have well water, so that comes out very cold, but it's typically about a 55-minute runoff because I'm not in a hurry to do it. We can make it go a little faster, but it's kind of nice. So, some of the hops probably have about an hour 15 max contact time. And again, I just feel like you get a lot out of that, and they don't touch a boil. So whatever oils and acids are in there, are being released in a very gentle way compared to having them in a boil, like in a sack, hop sock, or something like that. So yeah, so what we do is I think I wrote this down on our procedures here. Yeah, so on my typical wet hop IPA recipe. So what we do is we turn off the kettle, and we boil a little lower than most of you down here at sea level. So we're about a 209, 210 boiling point, and then we do a 10-minute rest just to get the movement down. Then I do a quick whirlpool, mostly just for proteins, because at that point we don't really have any hops. Often there's almost nothing in the kettle. And then another 10-minute rest just to let that stop spinning, and then the transfer over. And so, like I said, by the time that all of that happens, we're probably about 205, 206 when the first beer comes in, and we're between 190 and 195 when the last beer goes out. And it's lower than normal, what we would normally do, but it because the hops are definitely cooling the beer down. They're not cold, but they definitely have an impact. And it's funny, I was unknowingly ahead of my time. Now when people are actually cooling wort to do hop bursting, in the 185 to 195 range, I wasn't doing it purposely. I was doing it because I didn't know any other way to use the hops. So I wasn't trying to be fancy about it, but it is kind of ending up having the same effect that some people are using for hazy IPAs to kind of help decrease bitterness. No, I've not tried to go lower. I like keeping it above 180 because I'm not picking the hops. I don't know what's in there. There's leaf material. Hey, we probably have the odd bug. So, to me, keeping it above 180 is very safe. But yeah, so I don't have any expertise in terms of, what impact a lower temperature might have. So. We usually keep the lids on. I mean, the only time we take the lids off is just for pictures and to keep the hops tamped down. So during runoff, the lids are on, so it is exactly that. It isn't closed the whole time. So we let gravity do its thing. We don't press it at all, but we do gently sparge it.
Okay.
At the end of the run, because it definitely, there's a little bit of beer in there, so we're just rinsing that little bit of the wort out. So I think I made a note. Yeah, we sparged the hops that were in the mash tun with hot water, and our final runnings after that for a 1041 beer dropped down to 1028, which didn't take long. I mean, that was probably less than a minute of just pure hot water running to drop the gravity. But even though it was just pure hot water running over the hops, we're still collecting at a 1028. So before everybody drinks it up, I wanted to talk about the Good Show Mr. Olson. So this is an all Centennial hopped, all Oregon, Crosby hopped beer. So these were just like the Chico one, overnighted. Only the second time I've brewed with Centennial as a wet hop. And again, you kind of think of those big pine citrusy flavors. And I think this is definitely a little bit more towards the citrus side of Centennial. But I feel like this is maybe a little bit closer approximation to what we're used to, given that this is a Northwest, product in terms of the hops that we would normally brew with. And this is just the wet hop version of them. So again, I'll ask what were some fun flavors people picked out of this one. Lavender, nice. Tangerine. Yeah, definitely some herbal spice. We just used the water from our hot liquor tank, so it probably is going into the hot liquor tank at about 140, 145. So not boiling, because I'm coming, at the kettle we're cleaning, and I'm just using Yeah, so I'm just using the water that we're recollecting from the runoff. So I'm just the heated up well water that's just going right back over the hops. So did you guys like this one? Okay, excellent. So I'm going to divert a little bit here for just 1 second and tell the story of why I named this beer Good Show, Mr. Olson. Anybody in the room here ever heard of Ralph Olson from Hop Union, Yakima Chief? Okay, good. Then I get to tell you why you should love Ralph Olson. So not only is he just a great guy, he's like, I've only known him as an older man, so to me, he's like everybody's grandpa. Danish heritage, just a big friendly smile on his face, great guy, obsessed with hops. So most hops are developed in a breeding program, often collectively, whether it's USDA or a group of universities or a group of growers, or it's funded by the big breweries, because somebody's got to pay for all this experimentation. The growers are, say, hey, we got an acre of this, a half acre of this. They don't know what's going to work or what's going to stick. But let's be honest, there's three brewing conglomerates that buy most of the hops. And so up until the 80s, 90% of the breeding programs were for bitterness. You wanted something clean and, really you're kind of almost growing not for flavor. So Coors, for example, has 13 different hops in it. And you're thinking, wow, I use 13 different hops in an IPA. Why is Coors doing that? It's like, well, for exactly opposite reasons. You're using 13 different hops to create flavor. They're using 13 different hops to minimize flavor. Because beer is an agricultural product, so if one hop's a little more this or that any given year, you'd never notice it. Because there's such small amounts of 13 different hops. So that the agricultural spikes can't impact the overall flavor of their beer. So in the early 80s, craft beers starting to become a thing. There's a few breweries in the Northwest, a few breweries, opening in California. And what was it? 1190 was the experimental number for Centennial. And, you have lots of things that the growers look at, like what's the flavor, what's the yield, what's the size of the cones, what is it resistant to powdery mildew, is it resistant to, pests and disease. So they're thinking about things that none of us are thinking about. We're thinking, does it smell good? Does it taste good? Am I going to make a great beer with it? And so, you can imagine all the growers in this room, and they're kind of voting yay or nay, like, hey, should we move forward with these hops? Well, so they get to talking about Centennial. And as Ralph tells the story, he's like, they're all getting up there, and the growers are saying, nah, I don't like it. The yield's not good. The bitterness isn't high enough. I don't know who's buying this hop. Like, we're not doing it. And Ralph gets up and he's like, well, I got a guy with a bike shop down in Chico who's buying a lot of this hop. And the guy down in Chico with the bike shop was Ken Grossman of Sierra Nevada in the very early days. And he's buying Centennial. And despite Ralph's protestations, the entire room votes it down. Kills the Centennial hop in the breeding program. Nobody's moving forward with it. Destroy your fields. We'll replant them with something new next year. Ralph doesn't do that. So Ralph keeps growing Centennial. Ralph keeps selling it on the side to Ken Grossman at Sierra Nevada. Sierra Nevada starts to get big. Ken Grossman wants more of this hop. Ralph's in a bit of a pickle because he's selling him a hop that technically does not exist. So he goes to the guys at the Washington State breeding program, and they say, hey, I got a confession to make. You remember that Centennial hop? And they're like, yeah, it was a great hop. And he goes, well, I still got 6 acres of it growing. And the guy's like, oh my God, don't tell anybody. And it just turned out that year happened to be the Centennial for the state of Washington. And that is why the Centennial hop has its name. And if Ralph Olson hadn't very stubbornly kept growing it to sell to that little guy with a bike shop in Chico, we literally would not have the Centennial hop today. So I will ask everybody to just raise a glass to Ralph Olson and the Centennial hop and all of our favorite beers that are brewed with it. So anyway, like I said, I've only brewed this beer twice, but I love telling the story of Ralph Olson and spreading the word. So Good Show, Mr. Olson is exactly that. So just getting down to some of the recipe formulation now, and I have no idea how I'm doing on time here. I know I'm probably rambling a little bit, but am I good for a few more minutes? Yeah. Okay, good. So, and then I'll answer any questions. I'll be here all night. So, as far as recipe formulation, how to build this, how to maximize the flavor. So oftentimes what I do is I add bitterness hops in the mash, and I think it adds a kind of softer bitterness, and it has, on the professional side, the advantage of I don't have anything in the kettle, so I can kind of maximize the amount of beer that I can get out of there. And so for the wet hops, I often do that because I do like that little bit softer bitterness that I get out of that. In a lot of our IPAs, I kind of split it. I'll add some hops in the mash, some hops in the kettle, both to keep the boil under control and just because it's more effective in terms of, punch. But again, not looking for a ton of punch here. So I'll often use the hops in the mash, adding at a recirculation point so that they'll go in. I'll do my hour-long, we'll mash in. I do a 45-minute rest, then a 15-minute recirc. And during that, I'll add the hops in on the top of the mash, and then we'll sparge. And this takes us about 75 minutes to sparge and get the kettle full, and about another 15 minutes to get the kettle to a boil. So that's where I'm deriving the bitterness from these two beers, was all 100% hops in the mash. So like I said, I think it contributes to that little bit of softer bitterness. I like adding no kettle hops. And again, there's nothing wrong with adding kettle hops to wet hop beers. In the past, I've done some wet hop double IPAs. And I don't think there's any way to get enough punch from a wet hop to truly have that double IPA kind of impact that people expect in San Diego. So I will use dried hops in that case. So the next round of hops we're getting is Amarillo, and we will mix in some Amarillo pellets in the dry hop and some Amarillo dried flowers in with our hop spa, as I'm going to start calling it because I like that. Just to give it that extra punch, to get it kind of up over the hump of being a nice drinkable IPA versus, a legitimate double IPA. Hop back is a great way to use wet hops if you have some kind of ability to do that. Like I said, just transferring it to a different vessel and being able to run off from that is how I do it. The dry hopping, I think, is great if you have the ability to, where you're growing your own hops or you're just dry hopping with them. You can just throw them right in. But the vacuum sealing, to me, is a godsend in terms of being able to save the hops for late additions, which, again, even if it's just a 5% boost in the flavor and aroma, I think it does make a difference and really makes kind of the unique characteristics of the wet hops sing just a little bit more. And I just touched on regular hops. So I'm just going to kind of fly through my IPA sort of base recipe here with my thoughts behind it. So this is a modified version of the base recipe for our cheat sheet IPA, which I named because it has all the cheater hops. It's Strata, Mosaic, Simcoe, and Strata, Simcoe, Mosaic, and Simcoe, Citra. That's what I'm missing. Simcoe, Citra, Strata, Mosaic. So those four hops. So predominantly use an American two-row base with a little bit of English two-row, just a dash of Vienna malt, and I use Briess Gold Pills Vienna, which I can give them a nice plug for here right at the beginning of this video. I didn't even really mean to, but it is one of my favorite grains right there. Briess Gold Pills Vienna. It's about a 4 Lovibond Vienna malt, just real nice. One of my favorite domestic malts, one of my favorite Vienna malts, period, and I've always liked Vienna malt. And then a little bit of acidulated. Our water's pretty neutral in Julian, but when I don't have a crystal malt, a dark malt, something else to help acidify the mash, I always like to just add a little bit of acidulated malt just to bring that pH down. So it's kind of like like I said, a base IPA recipe. I use it for a lot of our wet hops. I sometimes adjust, the overall quantities because I don't want every single one to be cookie cutter, but I do want every single one to kind of have a malt backbone, but not necessarily a big malt flavor profile, so that the hops can really kind of come forward on top of that. I'll often mash low. I look for maybe 50 to 60 IBUs total which, everybody has a feel for how much bitterness they like and how much bitterness they get out of hops. Again, I don't think wet hops are a massive contributor, but in the same way that you would calculate for adding, bitterness with late additions and IPAs, account for the fact that you're going to get some bitterness pickup from the late additions. I typically do a 75-minute boil across the board, 10-minute rest in the whirlpool I already went over, the hop spa, and then dry hopping. So I do just want to run through kind of our little brew day here because this was a lot of fun having guys up. So again, that's Brewer Ray. Great Western 2-row as our typical base malt. Underlet mashing in. Brandon Hernandez of San Diego Beer News once called us, and I thought this was very politically correct of him, the most soulful brewery in San Diego. And I'm like, Brandon, that's a really nice way of saying I have nothing that's automated. So yeah, it's an old chemical bucket, and we just mash in one bucket at a time. Everything's hand stirred, so I don't have a single bit of hard piping in the brewery. Mash tuns on wheels, so I can take it in and out of the brewery. That looks like it's pretty thick mash right there. Ray's working hard. So there we are. Oh yeah, 148 on the dot. Our hot liquor tank, all of our equipment, if you recognize anything, was all pretty much except our kettle and mash tun were in previous breweries in San Diego. So big box of hops, zipping the hops. He's not a working dog, so. Oh, so now this is a better picture with the Chinook, and you can see how kind of spiky some of those petals are. Sometimes they're very smooth and compact. Sometimes the cones are very strata, very small cones. Columbus, huge cones. Chinook, spiky cones. So they'll all look a little different. They're all basically the same, but they're all going to be a little different. Mash tun is a reclaimed dairy tank that I added the casters and all the necessary fittings to. Again, our very advanced Borloff recirculating system. So literally while this is happening, this is where I would just put our mash hops right in on top of that. And if I'm using whole cones, they'll just kind of form a layer up on the top. If I'm using pellets, they'll dissolve. Same thing, the top, maybe 2 inches of the mash will be a little green when we're scooping out. Otherwise, they don't penetrate any further than that. Chinook hops, pellets for the bitterness right there. Our sparge. Oh, there we go. A little video of sparge. And the vacuum sealing we've already been over. Yeah, the clean mash tun that we turned into a hop spa. Ah, there you go. More donuts and hops. We had a video of that. We couldn't get it off my phone, so I apologize. Oh my God, that's a great picture. I had not seen that one yet. That is actually my favorite picture of the night. That should have been up there earlier. There we go. More hops. So it's about, it must have been 4 or 5 boxes of those at least. So it was a decent number. Fill up the mash tun. I am looking official and tasting the wort, and that looks like it. We'll go back to the pretty hot picture. So, thank you very much for paying attention to me for the last 45, 50 minutes. I'm sure I've rambled on a lot of unnecessary things. I hope it's been entertaining. I hope it's been educational. I really am thankful for you having me here, and I am hoping that the glycol machine gets fixed this week. And that, by next weekend, we actually have this on tap. It'll be called Hook in Mouth Chinook from our brew day. And like I said, I'm happy to stick around here, answer any questions, but I figure we'll do a couple minutes of just questions with the microphone.
Yeah, go ahead and stick your hand up and I'll come around with the microphone.
Oh.
Great presentation. Do you know if there's going to be a wet hop festival at O'Brien's this year?
Funny you should bring up that. I had 2 things at the bottom of my list here to mention. One was Wet Hop Festival, October 13 through 15 at O'Brien's. So we typically have about 30 wet hop beers over the course of the weekend. A good number from San Diego, but typically a few from other parts of California. Not many these days from outside of California just because they don't get distributed down here. But we're hoping for the first time in a very long time to have one down from Russian River. So I
That's
think Vinny did a pair of them this year. So
That's this month, right?
October 13,
October
October 13 through 15.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because the Oregon hop harvest, the Centennial was the first batch of the Oregon hops that were sent down. That was August 24th. And so they're still knee deep in harvest for about another week or so. So a lot of these beers are actively being brewed right now. And like I said, the Idaho 7 won't even harvest for 2 more weeks. And then for the beers that are out of the area, we just got to get them worked through the distribution system. So we'll have some wet hop beers on tap before that. But the big fest will be the 13th through the 15th. With, like I said, I'm guessing between 25 and 30 over the course of the weekend.
Are you ever going to grow your sideburns back?
No.
Oh.
No, that was something a younger man had more time for.
So one last question. At the collaboration event last weekend, I heard the term from a professional brewer, crowd-pleasing bitterness. Is that a professional brewer's term, crowd-pleasing bitterness?
I not that I've ever heard, but I feel like it's appropriate because they're beers that are not intended to be walloping 7.5% San Diego IPAs. I think that if you said pick a term for both of these beers, I would think they have relatively crowd-pleasing bitterness. But my estimation of what that is in terms of IBUs is probably very different than an actual crowd. So, because you look at, so many hazy IPAs are, 40 IBUs or even less. And so to me, that's, you brewed a pale ale, you didn't make an IPA. So in order for IPA to have crowd-pleasing bitterness, I would think that would be kind of in the 40 to 60 range, which I think these beers probably are. And then, once you get over 60, you're making a big beefy IPA.
Tom, I got something.
Yeah.
I'm trying to wrap my mind around adding hops to the mash and the math of what that does to the IBUs. And I'm thinking, is it reducing the IBUs in the final product? And is it different than first wort hop addition?
A little different than first wort. And like I said, the main reason I do it is to eliminate stuff in the kettle that's you're going to gum up, runoff and loss in terms of volume. And I figure I'd probably get a little bit less bitterness. Like if I used, say, a 1/2 pound per barrel of Columbus to bitter in the kettle, that's probably going to be more impactful than if I used a 1/2 pound per barrel in the mash. And so sometimes I can adjust up for that. And, sometimes we do like brewing with whole cones. We do make 100% whole cone beers. So, we use the whole cones in the mash because I don't have a good way to use the whole cones in the kettle in any real quantity. So it's a way for us. It started with the whole cone beers, and then we've kind of adopted it to pellets. And just something, like I said, with most IPAs, we'll split it. We'll do some in the kettle, some in the mash. But we're probably getting, without having any scientific evidence to back this up, I'd say 10 or 15% less bitterness out of what we add in the mash. But I also think it comes across a little softer. So if that's the effect I want, then that's nice. But then, like I said, with most of the IPAs, that's why I also add hops into the kettle.
Thanks.
I got a side question.
Okay.
So what is your process to figure out how much wet hop you're going to use? Like, I know when I was first looking at this kind of stuff and I did my first wet hop beers, like there was like a multiplier, like, oh, well, with all the water weight and everything, it's like a 5X. And then, to get the same IBUs, and you end up doing it, and then you're like, how am I going to fit this in the kettle? It's not going to work out.
At some point you calculate
you're
it out.
trying to do it. So
you end up with almost more hops than you have liquid.
Since you have all the experience and you're making like 10 beers, 20 beers all the time, like is there a multiplier, or how do you go around crafting that recipe?
So 2 things. One, like with the Oregon grown hops, they sell them in 20-pound boxes. So I have to brew with them in 20-pound increments. So I feel like 60 pounds, maybe not quite as much as I want. And 20 pounds is maybe a little bit more. That I would probably buy exactly 70 pounds if I could. But instead I buy 80, and then I save some back for dry hopping. And then, with different styles, like I said, luckily we were able to do some experimentation early on when we had a lot of local hops around. and hop growers that were interested in figuring these things out. So, I would say typically for a pale ale, I would use half as much as I use for an IPA. So if I'm using, 10 pounds per barrel with an IPA, I would use 5 pounds per barrel with a pale ale. We also used about 5 pounds per barrel, counting the dry hops and everything else, with the bitter, but it was also because we were using extremely low alpha acid hop. We knew the Glacier was probably going to come in under 4%. We didn't think it would come in as low as 2.7. But, if I'd had a Chinook or something to use in a pale ale, I would probably be down in the 3 to 4 pound per barrel range. We've had wet hop lagers, brown ales, red ales. We've brewed a red IPA with one. And so, it's just kind of a feel for, what's the impact you want. So if the benchmark for me is, 10 pounds per barrel with an IPA, okay, how hoppy do I want it in relation to that? And how strong is the hop that I'm using? So again, we used more with the Glacier than I probably would have for that style had we had a stronger hop. When we did the wet hop lager, it was probably between 3 and 4 pounds because we were using something a little bit more oomphy than the Glacier, but not as strong as a Chinook. And, the one thing that I'm a creature of habit, I've told every brewer I've ever trained, like, look, what I'm doing is not gospel. What I'm doing is what worked once and I liked it, so I kept doing it. And it doesn't mean there's not better ways of doing things, and it doesn't mean that there's not equally good ways of doing things. I just find something that works for me, and then I keep going at it. So I would say that, my 10 pound per barrel benchmark with the IPA is what I stick with. And some are more intense than others. The Chinook, the all Chinook one, believe me, is way more intense than the all Centennial one. It's just a stronger hop. And the Centennial one to me is more intense than the California grown Cascade and Chinook one. So they're all going to be a little different. The Strata one, we brewed to be a slightly lower ABV to kind of help that one shine even a little more. So it's only like a 6.3 IPA. So sometimes I adjust the alcohol depending on how much I want, a certain hop to sing. And certainly, like I said, style and the hop you're using and where it's from will kind of be the other determining factors. But I don't have a strict like, hey, use exactly 7 times. I have a benchmark that works with the IPAs, and then I just base everything off of that.
And other types of hops, you don't look at it that way. You look at, like, here's my wet hop recipe, and I do wet hops, and I got 10 pounds per barrel for an IPA, and that's my line, and I write it back and forth depending on what the hop gives me. So if I'm going to try to do it, I got to think that way. I don't want to say like, well, I make this blind pig clone that is bomb and it uses X amount of ounces. I'm going to take that and multiply it by X. I got to think of different. I'm going to make it that. I want to use these hops and I'm going to go on your.
Just think about it. So it's been a long time since I brewed a 5-gallon batch. So just somebody tell me what a typical IPA, just average IPA range for ounces of hops to be used. What would you say? What's that? 13 ounces. Okay. So in this case, when I whittled the 10 pounds per barrel, down, it ended up being about, what is that? It's about 26 ounces per 5 gallons. And again, that's just finishing hops. So it doesn't take into account my bittering hops. So it would be more than that, overall. But so it's not. There's no exact science, like so I was saying. In terms, and scaling 10 barrels down to 5 barrels is also not an exact science. So, a lot of people who use fresh hops, they're growing them themselves. So the amount of hops you use in the beer is the amount of hops that you harvest. So there are a lot of factors that go into it. The one thing I will say, it's tough to use too many because it's just it. Like you said, we had that mash tun full of like almost 75 pounds of hops in 220 gallons of liquid, and so our volume, mass ratio, that's a 300-gallon tank that we damn near filled to the rim, because of all the volume that the hops are taking up. So most people aren't going to have another vessel that's not your brew kettle that's twice the size where you could jam too much hops into it to use. So, can you overuse them? Yeah. Is it likely? Probably not.
Cool. Louis. And I think this will probably be the last question.
So with all those hops and their water content, do you have to like make any adjustments for volumes because of the water, or is it just you just ignore that factor?
I will say, and that's an excellent question because I probably should have touched on this. I will say I typically find that by soaking the hops in that hop spa, it probably lowers my gravity. If I used the exact same recipe, dried hops, everything was normal, I'd probably be a point or two higher than if I didn't, soak it in those hops. So does it have an impact? Yeah, it's probably pretty minimal though. So in terms of overall utilization, and it probably does come from leaching a little bit of water out of them overall in the boil. But it's pretty minimal. So if I'm used to getting like say a 1062, I might get a 1060. So it is a small impact, but yeah, it definitely is there. And some of that, like I said, we sparge the hops afterwards. That probably dilutes it again just a little bit, but I can't imagine that dropping it more than a point.
I think one of the comments that you made when I was there on Brew Day was that because they are wet, they don't really change your volumes so much because they don't absorb. They don't absorb anything.
No, yeah, they don't really absorb much. They're not detracting from it, because they're absorbing beer. But I do think that we probably get a little bit of water buoyancy from them because I've noticed that overall, if you said, apples to apples, if I use the same recipe and I did it all with dried hops, I'd probably expect to be a point or two lower with the wet hops. So, and again, some of that's just sheer volume of material. So.
Cool. All right, everybody, let's give a big round of applause for Tom.